Santa Barbara woke up to a quiet kind of wealth, the kind that hides behind palm shadows and iron gates, where the ocean air drifts through gardens most people will never see. Inside one of those mansions, on the morning of May 9, 1914, the life of Charles William Post ended. To the public, he was a titan, a self-made American miracle. His products sat on breakfast tables from New York to San Francisco: Postum, grape, nuts, Post Toasties, names that had reshaped how a nation ate, how it advertised, how it bought. His company employed thousands. His fortune was immense. His confidence, in print at least, looked unbreakable. But behind the brand was a man running out of strength. For years, Post had battled persistent stomach pain that doctors struggled to explain. He had built an empire on discipline and healthy living, yet his own body refused to cooperate. By late 1913, he began withdrawing from public life. Appearances were canceled. Meetings were delayed. The days narrowed into a routine of discomfort and exhaustion, the kind that doesn't just wear down muscles, it wears down hope. In early March 1914, his condition grew urgent. A private rail car was arranged to rush him nearly 2,000 miles to the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota, then the cutting edge of American medicine. The Mayo brothers operated. The surgery was declared a success. An appendix was removed. The headlines would have liked that ending: crisis solved, genius saved, empire safe. But the pain didn't stop. Back in Santa Barbara, the symptoms returned like a verdict. Whatever was wrong, whatever the surgeons missed or couldn't fix, kept tightening its grip. And with it came something worse, a darkness that doesn't show up on X-rays, the kind that turns daylight into weight. The man who had preached positive thinking found himself unable to practice it. That morning in May, Charles Post died by suicide. The nation reacted the way it always does when a powerful man falls: shock, speculation, long obituaries thick with praise. Newspapers described his innovations, his advertising genius, his unstoppable rise. But almost immediately, the focus shifted, because Post had left behind something even more intriguing than his product line. He had left behind one child. Marjorie Meriwether Post was 27 years old, married, a mother of 2 young daughters, and now, in a single day, she inherited an empire worth $20 million, a fortune so vast it didn't just buy comfort, it bought control. But the money wasn't the most dangerous part. The real inheritance was responsibility. Marjorie didn't just receive wealth, she received power. She now stood at the top of Postum Cereal Company, one of the fastest growing food corporations in America. Shareholders would watch her. Workers would depend on her. Competitors would test her. And society, especially in an era when women were still denied basic rights, would quietly wait for her to fail. Because in 1914, a woman inheriting this kind of authority wasn't just rare. It was threatening. The funeral took place in Battle Creek, Michigan on May 15th. Post was laid to rest in a granite mausoleum built like a monument, as if stone could preserve what a man's body could not. Marjorie stood there knowing the truth no one else could fully feel. This wasn't only the end of a life. It was the beginning of hers. She was no longer only in hair. She was the owner of a machine that would either grow or collapse, based on what she did next. And the question hanging over everything was simple. Was she ready? Because the truth is, Charles Post hadn't raised his daughter like other wealthy men raised theirs. He didn't only teach her manners. He didn't only prepare her for society. He trained her. And to understand how, we have to go back to the barn in Battle Creek, back to the beginning, back to the moment a restless inventor moved his family to a strange town obsessed with health, grain, and salvation. Marjorie Meriwether Post was born on March 15, 1887, in Springfield, Illinois, a city better known for Abraham Lincoln than for industrial ambition. Her arrival did not coincide with wealth. There were no estates, no servants, no inherited security waiting for her. What she was born into instead was restlessness. Her father, Charles William Post, was a man perpetually in motion, mentally, emotionally, professionally. He invented farm equipment. He patented ideas. He chased opportunity with manic energy. And he failed. Repeatedly. By the time Marjorie was old enough to remember, her father was already struggling, not just financially, but psychologically. Doctors called it neurasthenia, a fashionable diagnosis of the late 19th century. Today, it would likely be recognized as severe anxiety, depression, and nervous exhaustion. Whatever the name, the effect was the same. Charles Post was a brilliant man whose mind often turned against him. In 1891, when Marjorie was just 4 years old, the family made a decision that would change American culture forever. They moved to Battle Creek, Michigan. Battle Creek was not chosen for opportunity or comfort. It was chosen for desperation. The town had become famous for one institution, the Battle Creek Sanitarium, run by the eccentric and dogmatic Dr. John Harvey Kellogg. Kellogg believed disease came from diet, digestion, and moral weakness. His patients followed strict vegetarian regimens, exercised relentlessly, avoided stimulants, and submitted to treatments that bordered on obsession. Coffee was forbidden. Alcohol was forbidden. Pleasure itself was suspect. Charles Post checked himself in, hoping for relief. What he found was an idea. Among the bland meals served at the sanitarium was a coffee substitute made from roasted grains. Patients drank it because they were told coffee was poison. Post tasted it and saw something Kellogg never did: a product. If people would pay to drink this in a sanitarium, they would pay to drink it at home. Post left the sanitarium not cured, but inspired. He tried opening a competing health clinic, La Vida Inn, promising cures through positive thinking and suggestion. It failed, but the coffee substitute stayed with him. In 1895, working out of a small barn on family property, Charles Post created Postum. The drink was made from roasted wheat, bran, and molasses. It didn't taste like coffee. That didn't matter. What mattered was what Post told people it was doing to them. He launched one of the most aggressive advertising campaigns America had ever seen. Coffee, Post claimed, caused nervous breakdowns, ruined families, weakened men, and destroyed productivity. His ads were bold, accusatory, and impossible to ignore. "Is your yellow streak caused by coffee?" one campaign asked. Others warned that coffee would push men into the big crowd of mongrels. The claims were outrageous. They were also wildly effective. Demand exploded. Within 2 years, Post needed a factory. Within 5, he was a millionaire. And Marjorie was watching everything. She was 8 years old when Postum began to succeed. Her contribution was small but symbolic. She glued labels. She folded packaging. She spent hours in the barn watching raw materials turn into boxed products that would soon sit on breakfast tables across the country. She didn't just see success, she saw process. Her father noticed something about her early on. She paid attention. Most children absorb the noise of adult work without curiosity. Marjorie asked questions. Not just what he was doing, but why. Why that slogan? Why that distributor? Why that price? Her father answered. Then he tested her. In 1897, Post launched his first cereal grape, Nuts, a product containing neither grapes nor nuts. Like Postum, it succeeded on advertising more than flavor. Post claimed it could cure ailments ranging from appendicitis to loose teeth. There were no regulators yet to stop him. The factory expanded. Workers numbered in the hundreds. Battle Creek became the cereal capital of the world. And that same year, Charles Post made a decision almost unheard of for the era. He began bringing his 10-year-old daughter to board meetings. This was not symbolic. She sat through real discussions about contracts, rail lines, inventory, margins. She listened quietly at first, absorbing language most adults never learned. Words like accounts receivable, distribution networks, market penetration became part of her mental vocabulary. On carriage rides home, her father explained his decisions. Why he said yes. Why he said no. Why advertising mattered more than ingredients. By her early teens, Marjorie toured factories alone. She watched production lines. She understood logistics. She knew which railroads were reliable and which caused delays. She learned how fragile systems really were, and how much discipline it took to keep them running. In 1901, at 14, she was sent to Mount Vernon Seminary in Washington, D.C., a finishing school meant to polish young women for society. She learned etiquette, languages, posture, and presentation. But she did not forget Battle Creek. During school breaks, her father took her to Europe, not to tour cathedrals, but to visit factories, meet distributors, and observe international commerce. While others admired art, Charles Post taught his daughter how money moved across borders. By 17, Marjorie was no longer just a rich man's daughter. She was an apprentice. Her father had no son, and without ever saying it aloud, he was preparing her for something no woman of her era was supposed to inherit: power. She didn't know that he had less than a decade left to live. She didn't know that she would soon control everything he had built. She only knew that she was learning, and that the lessons mattered. They would matter far more than anyone yet realized. Marjorie Meriwether Post met Edward Bennett close at the precise moment society expected her to disappear into it. The year was 1904. She was 17, fresh from finishing school, polished, composed, and already wealthy beyond imagination. Edward was 22, a graduate of Columbia Law School, and a member of one of Greenwich, Connecticut's established old families. He was not rich in the way the Posts were rich, but he possessed something equally valuable in American high society: acceptance. The close family belonged. Their name opened doors that even millions could not force. For Charles William Post, whose fortune was still considered new, this mattered. For Marjorie, navigating the rigid, unspoken hierarchy of elite America, it mattered even more. What they felt for each other is impossible to measure now. The historical record is polite, reserved, careful. What is clear is that the match made sense to both families and to society at large. They married on December 3, 1905, in New York City. Marjorie was 18 years old. The wedding was elegant but restrained. Charles Post understood that excessive displays of wealth invited scrutiny. The couple settled into the expected rhythm of upper-class life. Edward practiced law. Marjorie managed the household. She learned which dinners mattered, which charities carried prestige, which families were worth cultivating. To the outside world, she became what she was supposed to be: a society wife. But she never severed her connection to Postdom. She attended board meetings when possible. She reviewed reports. She followed acquisitions and advertising strategies. She maintained her grip on the business quietly, methodically, even as she played her public role. Their first daughter, Adelaide, was born on July 22, 1908. A second daughter, Eleanor, followed on December 3, 1909. By every standard of the era, Marjorie had achieved perfection: marriage, children, wealth, status. The marriage, however, was hollow. Edward Close exists in history more as a formality than a presence. He appears in photographs but not in stories. Marjorie would later speak of him rarely, and when she did, without warmth or bitterness, just absence. By 1914, their marriage functioned, but it did not thrive. Then the world broke open. In May 1914, Marjorie's father took his own life. Overnight, she inherited $20 million and control of a major corporation. She was no longer a wealthy wife attached to power, she was the power. 3 months later, Europe went to war. At first, the conflict seemed distant. America declared neutrality. New York society continued its dinners and dances. But the casualty lists grew impossible to ignore. Trenches swallowed entire generations. Hospitals overflowed. Medical supplies ran out. Marjorie read everything. And then she acted. In 1916, while the United States still debated whether to enter the war, Marjorie began organizing a base hospital in partnership with the American Red Cross. She didn't just donate money. She managed logistics. She recruited doctors and nurses. She arranged equipment, transport, and supplies. She applied the same operational discipline she had learned in Battle Creek: scale, efficiency, precision. When America entered the war in April 1917, Edward Close was commissioned as an officer and sent to France. He would serve with distinction, earning promotion and later a French military decoration. At the same time, Base Hospital No. 15 opened in Savonay, France. It was one of the largest American military hospitals in Europe, capable of treating 240 patients at once. Marjorie had funded much of it herself. She traveled to France and walked the wards. She spoke to wounded soldiers. She saw what war actually cost. Somewhere nearby, her husband was fighting. Elsewhere, her hospital was saving lives. The experience changed her. This was not philanthropy in the abstract. This was creation with consequence. Not cereal boxes or advertising slogans, but men being put back together after destruction. Edward returned home in 1918, a decorated war hero. The marriage did not recover. While he had been gone, Marjorie had discovered something irreversible: independence. She had operated at scale without him. She had moved through political and organizational worlds that did not need her husband's approval. The young woman who had married in 1905 no longer existed. Edward's mother died in July 1919. Whatever emotional glue remained dissolved with her passing. The divorce was finalized in November 1919. Marjorie retained custody of her daughters. Edward would remarry the following year and go on to become the grandfather of actress Glenn Close, a curious footnote in a life that never quite intersected with his former wife's legacy. Marjorie was 32 years old, divorced, powerful, experienced in war logistics, owner of a corporate empire, a woman who now knew that society's expectations were optional, and that knowledge would lead her directly to a man who understood power not socially, but financially. His name was Edward Francis Hutton. Edward Francis Hutton had already buried the most important people in his life by the time he met Marjorie Merriweather Post. His first wife, Blanche Horton Hutton, died in December 1917, taken by the Spanish influenza that swept the world as relentlessly as the war itself. Their only child, Halcott Hutton, was just 15 years old when he lost his mother. Edward was 44, wealthy, disciplined, and emotionally hollowed out. But Hutton was not a man who collapsed under grief. He worked. In 1904, he and his brother had founded E.F. Hutton Company, a brokerage firm built on a simple but radical idea. Wall Street should not belong only to Wall Street. While other firms concentrated power in New York, Hutton expanded west. He opened offices across the country. He used telegraphs and telephones to execute trades remotely, shrinking distance and democratizing access to markets. By 1920, E.F. Hutton was the second largest brokerage firm in the United States. So when Marjorie Merriweather Post met Edward Hutton, she did not meet a man dazzled by her fortune. She met an equal. She was 33, freshly divorced, in control of a massive food company, and already tested by war and loss. He was nearly 10 years older, widowed, disciplined, and fluent in the mechanics of money. He understood leverage, scale, timing. He knew how fortunes grew and how they vanished. What attracted her is not recorded in letters or diaries, but the pattern is clear. Hutton understood business in a way her first husband never had. He spoke the language her father had taught her. He listened. They married on July 7, 1920. The ceremony was quiet by their standards. She was still a divorced woman in an unforgiving society. He was still grieving. Neither needed spectacle. Then tragedy struck again. On September 25, 1920, just weeks after the wedding, Halcott Hutton was killed in a horseback riding accident on Long Island. He was 18 years old. In 3 years, Edward had lost his wife and his son. Marjorie stood beside him through the grief. Whatever else their marriage would become, it began as a partnership forged in shared loss. And it was a partnership. Unlike most husbands of the era, Hutton did not attempt to control Marjorie's business interests. He respected her competence. He understood that she was not merely wealthy, she was trained. She knew the factory floors, the advertising budgets, the distribution networks. She had grown up inside a corporation. In 1922, Hutton took Postum public, listing shares on the New York Stock Exchange. The move injected capital and scrutiny in equal measure. A year later, he became chairman of the board. Together, they expanded aggressively. Throughout the 1920s, Postum acquired brands that would define American kitchens for generations: Jell-O, Baker's Chocolate, Maxwell House Coffee, Hellman's Mayonnaise, Log Cabin Syrup, Calumet Baking Powder, Minute Tapioca. The strategy was brutally simple and devastatingly effective. Buy trusted brands. A. Apply superior advertising and distribution. B. Scale nationally. In 1929, Postum changed its name. It became General Foods Corporation. Marjorie had transformed her father's coffee substitute company into the largest food conglomerate in America. They lived accordingly. In 1922, the Huttons built Hillwood on the 176 acres of Long Island, a Tudor revival estate staffed and manicured to perfection. But even Hillwood wasn't enough for Marjorie. She wanted something more ambitious. Something permanent. Something that would announce, not wealth, but dominance. That desire would lead her south, to a narrow strip of land between ocean and lake, and to the creation of a house so theatrical, so extravagant, that it would later become one of the most famous and controversial mansions in American history. Before that happened, however, Marjorie gave birth to her third daughter. On December 29, 1923, Nadania Marjorie Hutton was born, the child who would later become actress Dina Merrill. The family now included 3 girls, and Hutton treated them all as his own. On the surface, everything worked. Business flourished, power expanded, wealth multiplied. But business partnerships and marriages obey different laws, and the cracks, quiet at first, were already forming. Because Marjorie was about to build a palace that would reveal both the height of her ambition and the beginning of the end of her second marriage. The first house Marjorie built in Palm Beach was a mistake. In 1921, she and Edward Hutton constructed a pleasant villa near the Everglades Club. It was called Hogarcito, Little Hearth in Spanish. Designed by the respected architect Marion Sims Wyeth, it was tasteful, comfortable, and entirely inadequate. It sat on a golf course, not the ocean. It was suitable for dinners, not spectacles. It hosted guests, but it did not overwhelm them, and Marjorie Merriweather Post did not intend to be merely comfortable. By 1924, she found what she wanted: a 17-acre strip of land in Palm Beach, perched on a coral ridge between the Atlantic Ocean and Lake Worth. From the highest point, water could be seen in every direction. Ocean to the east, lake to the west. The name was inevitable: Mar-a-Lago Cedar Lake. The land itself was cheap, purchased for roughly $100 during Florida's speculative boom. What followed was anything but. Marjorie hired Wyeth to design the structure, but she was not interested in academic restraint. Wyeth's training at the École des Beaux Arts emphasized balance, proportion, and rules. Marjorie wanted theater. For that, she brought in Joseph Urban, an Austrian-born designer famous for creating dazzling sets for the Metropolitan Opera and the Ziegfeld Follies. Urban had never designed a private residence. That was precisely why she chose him. Wyeth handled structure. Urban handled illusion. The collaboration was tense. Wyeth reportedly regretted the project for the rest of his life. Mar-a-Lago broke rules architects preferred to follow. But Marjorie was not building for approval. She was building a statement. Construction stretched from 1923 to 1927. More than 600 workers labored on the site. Nearly 300 craftsmen were brought from Europe: stone carvers, tile setters, sculptors, men whose skills had been passed down through generations. The materials alone bordered on obsession. 3 shiploads of Doria limestone arrived from Genoa, Italy, chosen because it aged quickly, making the new building look ancient. 36,000 antique Spanish tiles, some dating to the 15th century, were embedded throughout the house. 20,000 roofing tiles came from dismantled Cuban buildings. Black and white marble floors were salvaged from a Cuban castle. Cypress beams were sandblasted to appear centuries old. Joseph Urban recruited the sculptor Franz Barwig and his son to carve whimsical stone figures, monkeys, parrots, mythic creatures, giving the estate a fairy tale quality absent from America's more austere Gilded Age mansions. When Mar-a-Lago opened in January 1927, it stunned Palm Beach. A 75-foot tower dominated the skyline. The main house contained 58 bedrooms and 33 bathrooms. The living room alone spanned 800 square feet, with ceilings rising 42 feet overhead. Every bathroom featured gold-plated fixtures, which Marjorie insisted were easier to clean than silver. The house was designed not just for beauty, but for endurance. Walls were 16 inches thick, reinforced against hurricanes. Bomb shelters were built into the structure, residual fear from World War I etched into architecture. It required a permanent staff of 60. It hosted circuses, charity galas, costume balls. Once, the entire Ringling Brothers and Barnum and Bailey Circus performed on the grounds for local children. The final cost reached $70 million, well over $100 million today, not including the art and antiques that continued to fill its rooms. Edward Hutton was horrified. He complained privately that construction estimates meant nothing, that costs were uncontrollable, that Marjorie had gone too far. He wasn't wrong, but he also didn't understand something fundamental. Mar-a-Lago was not built to please a husband. It was built to outlast one. In March 1927, the Huttons hosted a lavish dinner before the Everglades costume ball, dressed as members of the court of Louis XVI. Palm Beach society understood the message immediately. A new standard had been set, and at its center stood Marjorie Merriweather Post, at the peak of her power, surrounded by magnificence, convinced that everything she touched could be shaped by will alone. She did not yet know that this palace marked not only the height of her marriage, but the beginning of its unraveling. Mar-a-Lago was magnificent, but it did not move, and Marjorie Merriweather Post had never been a woman content to stay in one place. For years, she and Edward Hutton had owned yachts, sleek, powerful vessels with black hulls, each one named Hussar. They sailed as symbols of taste and wealth, floating salons where deals were discussed and alliances reinforced. Yet by the late 1920s, Marjorie decided that the next yacht would not merely impress. It would dominate. She wanted the largest private sailing yacht in the world. In 1929, Edward commissioned the project from the Germaniawerft shipyard in Kiel, Germany, one of the most advanced shipbuilders of the era. The specifications were unprecedented for a private vessel: 316 feet long, 4 towering masts, 29 sails, a main mast rising 178 feet above the waterline. The cost approached $1 million, an extraordinary sum even before the Great Depression tightened its grip on the global economy. The timing was absurd. The stock market had crashed. Fortunes were evaporating. Luxury was becoming unfashionable, even dangerous. But the Huttons proceeded anyway. For Marjorie, this was not indulgence. It was a declaration her world would not shrink simply because others were afraid. She took personal control of the interiors. Unsatisfied with guesswork, Marjorie enrolled in a course on marine engineering, determined to understand the physical constraints of ship design. In a Brooklyn warehouse, she had the outline of each cabin drawn on the floor at full scale. Furniture was moved in and out repeatedly until every piece fit with mathematical precision. Nothing was accidental. The yacht was launched in April 1931 and christened Hussar V. A crew of 72 was required to operate and maintain the vessel. The interiors rivaled European palaces. Marjorie's personal suite featured white Carrara marble, a fireplace and bathroom adorned with golden swan-shaped fixtures. Edward's cabin was finished in pink Carrara stone, complete with a generous dressing room. Throughout the ship, rare objects filled every space. Murano chandeliers glowed in the main salon. Venetian mirrors multiplied candlelight. Brass fittings were polished daily to a blinding shine. The Huttons lived aboard the yacht for 6 to 9 months each year. In 1932 alone, they sailed more than 16,000 miles, from the Caribbean to Panama, from the Galapagos to Alaska, from the Mediterranean to Tahiti. At sea, Marjorie found something she could not achieve on land: privacy. No reporters, no society columns, no expectations beyond her own. Against endless horizons she entertained royalty, diplomats, and industrialists, all while remaining entirely beyond reach. Hussar V was freedom rendered in steel, sail, and marble. But the marriage that produced the yacht did not survive the decade. By 1935, Edward Hutton's infidelities had accumulated beyond denial. Evidence was undeniable. The trust that had once defined their partnership dissolved quietly, without public scandal. The divorce followed. Marjorie kept the yacht. She renamed it Sea Cloud, ordered the black hull repainted white, and described the transformation as symbolic. The past was being stripped away. Something new was beginning. Within 3 months, she married again. Her new husband, Joseph Edward Davies, was not a financier, but a Washington lawyer and diplomat, a man whose influence flowed through politics rather than markets. The marriage would carry Marjorie into a world far more dangerous than Palm Beach society or Wall Street competition. Soon, Sea Cloud would no longer be a pleasure yacht. It would become a diplomatic weapon. And Marjorie Merriweather Post was about to enter the most consequential chapter of her life, one where wealth met ideology, and luxury sailed directly into the heart of Soviet Russia. When the stock market collapsed in October 1929, the country changed overnight. Men who had built fortunes over decades lost everything in weeks. Banks failed. Factories closed. Lines formed outside soup kitchens that had not existed months earlier. In New York, shantytowns rose in Central Park, their residents living in sight of Fifth Avenue's glittering windows. Marjorie Merriweather Post watched it all from a position of rare security. General Foods suffered losses, but it did not collapse. People still had to eat. Food companies survived where banks did not. Her wealth shrank on paper, but it remained vast. She was still one of the richest women in America. That made what she saw even harder to ignore. She lived surrounded by mansions, servants, art, and jewelry of historic value, while families a few miles away could not feed their children. The contrast became unbearable. So she did something that stunned her social circle. Marjorie canceled the insurance policy on her jewelry collection. It was one of the most valuable private collections in the country: diamonds, emeralds, Marie Antoinette earrings, Napoleon era tiaras. The insurance premiums alone cost a fortune. She locked the jewels away in a bank vault, out of sight, out of use, and redirected the money. Not to another charity gala, not to a named wing of a museum, but to feeding people. In partnership with the Salvation Army, she opened the Marjorie Post Hutton Canteen in Hell's Kitchen, one of Manhattan's poorest neighborhoods. This was not a typical soup kitchen. Marjorie insisted on something radical for the time: dignity. The space was clean. The meals were well prepared. Women and children could eat without humiliation. At its peak, the canteen served 1,000 meals a day, every day, from 1930 to 1935, and Marjorie did not disappear after writing the checks. She visited regularly. She inspected the kitchens. She spoke with staff. She made sure the food met her standards. The woman who hosted European royalty, now worried about whether unemployed mothers felt respected while eating lunch. At Christmas, she went further. Wrapped in a raincoat and boots, Marjorie Merriweather Post stood on a Manhattan street corner ringing a Salvation Army bell, asking passersby for spare change. No press. No photographers. No society columns. The richest woman in America, quietly collecting coins. Some of her peers were appalled. This was not how wealth was supposed to behave. Charity was acceptable at arm's length through foundations, banquets, and donor lists. Standing in the cold, asking strangers for money, was something else entirely. But Marjorie understood something many of them did not. Her fortune existed because ordinary Americans bought her father's products. They had made her rich long before the Depression took their security. She believed she owed them more than polite sympathy. Her work expanded beyond the canteen. She sponsored massive charity events at Madison Square Garden. She led fundraising campaigns for emergency aid. She served on unemployment relief committees across New York State. While others protected their comfort, she stepped directly into the crisis. The Depression also clarified something else. Her marriage to Edward Hutton was no longer sustainable. He showed little interest in her charitable work. While she stood in soup lines and supervised relief efforts, he continued his routines, his distance growing more pronounced. The values that once aligned in business no longer aligned in life. The contrast was devastating. She had locked away her diamonds to help strangers. Her own husband would not sacrifice even his attention. By 1935, the decision was inevitable. The marriage ended. The jewelry would eventually return to her hands, but she was no longer the same woman who had worn it before. The depression had stripped something away and revealed something harder beneath. Waiting in the wings was Joseph Edward Davies, a man whose influence did not come from Wall Street or society, but from politics and power at the highest level. And through him, Marjorie Merriweather Post was about to step into the most dangerous arena she had ever entered. Marjorie Merriweather Post sensed the truth before she could prove it. At first, it came as a change in rhythm. Edward Hutton stayed out later. Explanations became vague. His attention drifted even when he was physically present. There was nothing dramatic, no shouting, no public scenes, just the quiet erosion of trust that precedes certainty. In another marriage, in another era, she might have looked away. Many women of her class did. Divorce in the 1930s was not simply a personal decision. It was a public ordeal. Newspapers lingered. Friends chose sides. Reputation suffered. Children paid the price. For wealthy families, appearances were often preserved at any cost. But Marjorie was not built for denial. She had been trained from childhood to identify problems and solve them. If her marriage was broken, she wanted proof, not suspicion, not rumor, but evidence. New York divorce law allowed only one ground for ending a marriage: adultery. Emotional distance meant nothing. Unhappiness meant nothing. A wife had to demonstrate a specific act, involving a specific person, at a specific time and place. Marjorie approached the task like an executive conducting an audit. She placed small bells on doors and windows, inaudible during the day, unmistakable at night. She stretched silk threads across hallways at ankle height, nearly invisible in the dark. She dusted talcum powder on floors to capture footprints that could not lie. The house became a silent instrument of truth. The affair was not with a glamorous socialite or a Broadway actress. It was with her own maid, a woman employed inside her household, beneath her roof, paid with her money. The traps worked. Threads snapped. Footprints appeared where they should not have. Bells rang in the night. Marjorie did not confront Edward in rage. She gathered the evidence, consulted her lawyers, and filed for divorce in 1935 on the grounds the law required. Edward did not contest it. He understood that resistance would only prolong humiliation and amplify damage. The settlement was handled as discreetly as wealth and influence allowed, but the rumor still traveled quickly through Palm Beach and Manhattan. The outcome was decisive. Marjorie kept Mar-a-Lago. She kept Sea Cloud. She retained her controlling interest in General Foods. She maintained custody arrangements that favored her for their daughter, Nadania. Edward walked away with his firm and what remained of his dignity. Within a year, he remarried a much younger woman and remained married to her for the rest of his life. Marjorie did not linger. Just 3 months after the divorce was finalized, she married Joseph Edward Davies. Davies was 59 years old, a seasoned Washington lawyer with deep ties to the Democratic Party and direct access to President Franklin D. Roosevelt. He moved in political circles that fascinated Marjorie, worlds where power was exercised not through markets or society, but through governments and ideology. The speed of the marriage raised eyebrows. Some whispered that the relationship had begun before the divorce. Others assumed Marjorie could not bear to be without a husband. Neither explanation fully captured the truth. Marjorie was 48. She had already wasted years in a marriage that had turned hollow. She saw no reason to waste more time mourning something that deserved none. Davies offered what Edward never had: proximity to state power. and Roosevelt was about to offer Davies an assignment that would carry Marjorie farther from Palm Beach than she had ever traveled. The American embassy in Moscow needed a new ambassador, and Marjorie Merriweather Post was about to step into Stalin's Russia, a place where wealth meant nothing, surveillance meant everything, and history was being erased in real time. They arrived in Moscow on January 19, 1937. The train from Berlin had taken 2 days and 2 nights, cutting across a frozen Europe and into the heart of the Soviet Union. On the platform at Belorusky Station, Soviet officials waited alongside American embassy staff, photographers crowding the snow, dusted air with flashing bulbs. Marjorie Merriweather Post stepped down arm in arm with her husband, Joseph Edward Davies, the newly appointed United States ambassador to the USSR. She was 50 years old, she was beginning her 3rd marriage, and she was entering one of the most dangerous capitals in the world. Their new home was Spaso House, a Grand Prix revolutionary mansion built in 1914 for a wealthy Russian merchant. After the Bolsheviks seized power, the house was confiscated and repurposed as the American ambassador's residence. Its main hall rose 82 feet, crowned by a massive crystal chandelier, believed to be the largest in any private home in Moscow. Marjorie took one look and saw work to be done. She and Davies paid for extensive renovations out of their own pocket. The wiring was replaced, American bathtubs were installed, furniture, tableware, and linens were shipped from abroad. Most remarkably, Marjorie arranged for monthly shipments of frozen foods from the United States, allowing her to host dinners unlike anything Soviet officials had experienced since the fall of the empire. She understood something instinctively. Hospitality was diplomacy. At Spaso House, she hosted elaborate luncheons and dinners that stretched for hours. Champagne flowed. Caviar appeared in abundance. French and Russian porcelain shared tables adorned with orchids in soft pastels. Seating arrangements were calculated with surgical precision. Who sat next to whom, who spoke which language, who needed flattery and who needed silence. The Soviet elite were stunned. Many had grown up under privation. Some had risen through revolution and violence. None had lived like this, and yet Marjorie treated them not as curiosities or enemies, but as guests, warmly, confidently, without apology for her wealth or her country. That honesty worked. The Devises were liked, trusted, even. In a regime defined by suspicion, their unapologetic capitalism made them strangely easier to deal with than diplomats who tried to disguise it. But the luxury came with a price. Spaso House was bugged. Microphones were hidden in walls, fireplaces, and ventilation shafts. Embassy staff warned Marjorie to tap a spoon against metal or glass whenever sensitive conversations arose, the noise disrupting the listening devices. Guests were told their luggage might be searched multiple times a day. Domestic staff reported directly to Soviet intelligence. The Devises were followed everywhere. In photographs from the period, Joseph and Marjorie walk along snowy roads lined with birch trees, elegant, composed, while a Soviet police car lingers in the background, its presence deliberate and unmistakable. Beyond the embassy walls, terror ruled. Stalin's Great Purge was underway. Former revolutionaries were arrested, tortured into confessions, and executed. Show trials filled Moscow's Hall of Columns, where men who had built the Soviet state publicly admitted to impossible crimes, conspiracies with Nazis, plots to assassinate Lenin, sabotage against socialism itself. Joseph Davies attended these trials as an official observer. He believed them. He reported to Washington that the confessions were genuine, that the Soviet government was defending itself against internal enemies. His later book, Mission to Moscow, would sell hundreds of thousands of copies and be adapted into a Hollywood film. It would also be condemned by historians as dangerously naive a propaganda. Marjorie said little. She focused on her role, hosting, observing, collecting. Because amid the fear and surveillance, she noticed something extraordinary. The Soviet government was selling off the treasures of the Russian Empire. Churches had been stripped. palaces emptied, noble estates looted. The regime needed foreign currency, and it possessed centuries of Romanov wealth, Fabergé objects, imperial porcelain, silver, icons, jewels, all stacked in warehouses or sold through state-run commission shops. Marjorie began to buy. What started as curiosity became conviction. Every purchase felt like a rescue. Objects that might have been melted down or lost forever were instead packed into crates and shipped west. She did not yet realize the scale of what she was building, only that she was preserving the remnants of a civilization being deliberately erased. In June 1938, Davies' Moscow assignment ended. He was transferred to Belgium, and the couple left the city behind, leaving the microphones, the trials, the purges, and the unmarked graves. Marjorie carried with her something else. The foundation of what would become the greatest collection of Imperial Russian art outside Russia. The Bolshevik Revolution had been ruthless, but it was also methodical. When the Romanov dynasty fell in 1917, the new Soviet state inherited 3 centuries of accumulated wealth. Imperial palaces filled with porcelain and gold. Churches layered in icons framed with silver and jewels. Noble estates stocked with furniture, tapestries, and objects commissioned by generations who assumed their world would last forever. The revolution had no use for beauty, but it desperately needed foreign currency. Beginning in the 1920s, the Soviet government began liquidating its own cultural inheritance. Sales were conducted through shadowy state agencies, and commission shops open only to foreigners. Warehouses filled with confiscated treasures, objects stacked carelessly, priced by weight rather than history. Paintings from the Hermitage went abroad. Jewels from the Imperial Diamond Fund appeared in European auctions. Icons that had survived centuries of devotion were treated as scrap metal. An American businessman named Armand Hammer recognized the opportunity early. He arrived in Russia in 1921, ostensibly to provide humanitarian aid, and stayed nearly a decade. When the Soviets forbade him from exporting profits in rubles, he negotiated permission to export antiques instead. Hundreds of Romanov treasures crossed the Atlantic. Hammer sold them in New York, even through department stores, where imperial icons and Fabergé objects appeared behind glass at Lord and Taylor, marketed as exotic relics from a vanished world. By the time Marjorie Merriweather Post arrived in Moscow, the most famous pieces were already gone. But not everything. What remained required patience, discernment, and conviction. Marjorie explored commission shops and government storerooms with the same disciplined curiosity she brought to business acquisitions. She discovered silver chalices sold by weight, their craftsmanship ignored. She found church vestments embroidered with gold thread and pearls, tossed aside like discarded fabric. She uncovered icons stacked against warehouse walls, their meaning erased by ideology. Joseph Davies noticed them first. The solemn faces, the stillness, the sense of time compressed into painted wood. His interest drew Marjorie deeper. Together, they began acquiring icons, not as decoration, but as historical witnesses. Royal doors from iconostases, images of St. George, representations of the Old Testament Trinity, objects once central to spiritual life, now treated as surplus inventory. Marjorie understood what she was seeing. This was not a sale. It was a liquidation of memory. She began buying compulsively, but not carelessly. Imperial porcelain from the Russian factories. Silver drinking vessels crafted by master goldsmiths, whose workshops had been shut forever. Enamel work that fused Byzantine tradition with European technique. Chalices that had once held communion wine in churches now demolished or repurposed. She had collected fine objects before, French gold boxes, European jewelry, but Russia was different. This was not taste. This was preservation. Her relationship with Fabergé began almost by accident. In 1926, she purchased an amethyst quartz box simply because it appealed to her eye. Only later did she understand its origin. The turning point came years afterward, when her daughter Eleanor gave her something extraordinary. The Catherine the Great egg. Created by Peter Carl Fabergé, It had been presented by Tsar Nicholas II to his mother, Empress Maria Fyodorovna, on Easter morning 1914, the same year Marjorie's father died. The egg was a masterwork of pink enamel and multicolored gold set with diamonds and pearls. Inside, it once contained a mechanical surprise, a tiny sedan chair bearing a miniature Catherine the Great. The mechanism had been lost before the egg left Russia. Stalin's government sold it to Armand Hammer. Hammer resold it, and eventually it reached Marjorie, who placed it in a room already forming in her mind, a space devoted entirely to Russia. The collection grew beyond anything she had imagined. Nearly 90 Fabergé objects, more than 60 imperial porcelain services, dozens of silver religious vessels, the nuptial crown of Empress Alexandra, worn at her wedding to Nicholas Tito in 1894, a diamond diadem worn by the last Tsarina on the day she became empress. Only about 20% of her Russian collection came directly from Moscow. The rest she acquired over decades, at auctions, through dealers, from collectors who had bought during the great Soviet sell-off. But the foundation was laid in those storerooms, where a woman with American dollars could rescue fragments of a civilization being dismantled. She did not yet know where the collection would live permanently. She only knew why it mattered. She was not assembling luxury. She was preserving evidence. Evidence that a world had existed, and that it had been destroyed deliberately. Every crate she shipped west saved something from oblivion. That purpose would eventually reshape the final decades of her life, and lead her to build not just houses and estates, but a museum for the nation. But before that could happen, there was still another world she would create, far from Moscow, far from Palm Beach, deep in the American wilderness. Marjorie Merriweather Post called it rustic. No one who visited ever agreed. The land lay in the Adirondack Mountains of New York, on a narrow ridge of sand and gravel known as an esker, rising between Spectacle Ponds and Upper St. Regis Lake. When Marjorie first acquired the property in 1920, it was reachable only by water. No roads, no crowds, no society obligations waiting at the door. That isolation was the point. She named the place Camp Topridge and immediately began turning it into something that redefined what retreat meant to an American billionaire. By 1923, the camp had grown into a sprawling compound of 68 buildings spread across more than 200 acres of forest and shoreline. The main lodge alone defied understatement. Its great room measured 80 by 100 feet, with ceilings soaring 25 feet overhead. Fireplaces large enough for a grown man to stand inside dominated the space. Fieldstone and massive Adirondack logs gave the illusion of frontier simplicity, but everything beneath that surface spoke of precision and expense. Guests did not arrive casually. They flew into Saranac Lake aboard Marjorie's private aircraft, a Vickers Viscount she named Merriweather in honor of her mother's family. From the airport, they were driven to a private dock and ferried across the lake by launch. At the boathouse, visitors faced a choice: climb a steep wooded path, or ride the covered funicular Marjorie, installed for her Aunt Molly, whose heart condition made the ascent impossible. The funicular delivered them into another world. Each guest was given a private cabin, complete with its own fireplace, fully stocked bar, private bathroom, and direct telephone connection to the main lodge. Every cabin came with a personal butler. A discreet system of call buttons allowed guests to summon almost anything: boatmen, fishing guides, masseurs, tennis partners, secretaries, without ever leaving their chair. During the peak summer season, from mid-July through Labor Day, 85 staff members operated Camp Topridge. Cooks, maids, guides, gardeners, and boat crews lived in separate quarters, moving through the property with near invisibility. Service was omnipresent and almost never seen. 3 evenings a week, the great room became a private cinema, screening full-length films for whoever happened to be staying. West lists over the years read like a directory of American power, senior military officers, diplomats, industrialists, foreign nobility. An invitation to Topridge was not casual. It was a signal. The DA Corps reflected Marjorie's collector's instincts and her comfort with contradiction. Native American artifacts stood beside mounted animal trophies. Eskimo kayaks hung from rafters. Antlers were woven into elaborate chandeliers. Stuffed animals and carved figures shared space with fine furniture and rare textiles. Some objects unsettled visitors: authentic scalps, frontier relics, curiosities from a violent past. Marjorie displayed them without apology. History, she believed, did not require comfort to deserve preservation. After returning from Moscow, she added something deeply personal: a Russian dacha rising among the Adirondack pines. Built in the traditional style, complete with onion domes and a massive tiled stove, it served as a private sanctuary. Inside, surrounded by Russian art and familiar forms, she revisited a world she had witnessed at the moment of its erasure. Toppridge continued to grow for decades. Additional parcels were purchased in 1924, 1938, and 1957, expanding the estate to encompass the ridge, shoreline, forests, and ponds. Originally called Hootridge, a blend of Hutton and Ridge, Marjorie renamed it Toppridge after her divorce, quietly erasing her second husband's name from the landscape. Names mattered. Ownership mattered. And Toppridge belonged to her alone. For more than 50 years, she returned every summer. While Mar-a-Lago staged grandeur and Hillwood curated culture, Toppridge offered something closer to freedom. There were still servants, still guests, still expectations. But here, she could walk wooded paths without photographers and watch films without society columnists recording who sat beside her. Eventually, she decided Toppridge would outlive her as something more than a private indulgence. She imagined it serving the public as a retreat, a place of reflection, a gift to the state that had allowed her family to prosper. Whether that vision would be honored was a question for the future. For now, Camp Toppridge stood as proof of something essential about Marjorie Merriweather Post. Even in the wilderness, she did not simplify, she composed. And one final, deeply personal chapter remained, centered not on empires or estates, but on the child who chose a life far removed from her mother's carefully constructed world. She was born into everything Marjorie Merriweather Post had built. On December 29, 1923, at the height of her mother's power and ambition, Nedania Marjorie Hutton entered the world. She was the only child of Marjorie's marriage to Edward Hutton, a girl whose infancy unfolded between Mar-a-Lago, Hillwood, and the deck of the largest private sailing yacht on Earth. From the beginning, Nedania's life was defined by abundance. Winters passed in Palm Beach, where servants moved silently through tiled corridors and the Atlantic glittered beyond the terraces. Summers were spent aboard Sea Cloud, where days unfolded to the rhythm of sails and sea wind. School years alternated between New York and Long Island, her childhood divided among properties most Americans would never see once, let alone call home. When Nedania was 11 years old, her parents divorced. The year was 1935, the year of bells, silk thread, and talcum powder. She stayed with her mother, watching her father remarry within months, watching her mother remarry just as quickly. The lesson was unspoken but unmistakable: marriages were temporary, privilege was permanent. She was educated at Miss Porter's School in Connecticut, an elite institution that shaped the daughters of America's ruling class. After graduation, she enrolled at George Washington University in Washington, D.C., where her stepfather, Joseph Davies, held political influence. She lasted 1 year. What Nedania wanted was unacceptable to both her parents. She wanted to be an actress. To Edward Hutton, acting was frivolous. To Marjorie, it was unnecessary, something people without options pursued. Why pretend to be someone else when you already had everything? But Nedania wanted one thing her mother could never give her. Something earned. She left the university and enrolled at the American Academy of Dramatic Arts in New York, studying under Uta Hagen, one of the most demanding acting teachers of the 20th century. She took modeling work at Vogue for $10 an hour, despite being a millionaire by inheritance before adulthood. When asked why she would work for such wages, she answered simply, because the ambition was hers. On the advice of family friends, she changed her name. She would not use Hutton. She would not use Post. Instead, she chose Dina Merrill, borrowing the surname of financier Charles E. Merrill, a rival and contemporary of her father. It was an act of quiet rebellion, distance from inherited power without denying its existence. Dinah made her Broadway debut in 1945, speaking only 3 lines in a play called The Mermaid's Singing. She was 21 years old and finally standing where she believed she belonged. Her mother was furious. Years later, Dina would describe what followed as pressure bordering on coercion. Marjorie insisted that a woman's first obligation was marriage and family. Acting could wait. Status could not. In 1946, Dina gave in. She left the stage and married Stanley Rumbaugh Jr., heir to the Colgate, Palmolive fortune, and a decorated Marine who had served as a White House aide. She turned down a 7-year film contract. She declined a role opposite Clark Gable. She stepped away from everything she had worked toward. A decade passed. 3 children were born: Ned, David, and Stanley Holler. The marriage provided stability, prestige, and comfort. But the desire to perform never disappeared. In her 30s, Dina returned slowly. Modeling led to television. Television led to Hollywood. Her film debut came in 1957 in Desk Set, opposite Katharine Hepburn. The role was small, but it established what Hollywood wanted from her: elegance, restraint, breeding. She did not need to act like an aristocrat. She was one. In Operation Petticoat and Butterfield 8, she played the role she would repeat throughout her career: the composed woman betrayed, dignified even as her private world collapsed. In Butterfield 8, Elizabeth Taylor won an Academy Award. Dinah played the wife who absorbed the damage quietly. Her first marriage ended in 1966. Within months, she married actor Cliff Robertson, with whom she would later appear on Batman as the villain's Shame and Calamity Jane, a rare moment of self-aware absurdity in a life defined by control. Like her mother, Dina carried responsibility alongside privilege. When her son David was diagnosed with juvenile diabetes at 13, she helped found what would become the Juvenile Diabetes Foundation, channeling grief into action. In September 1973, David died in a boating accident off Long Island. He was 23 years old. Days later, Marjorie Merriweather Post died as well. Grandmother and grandson were mourned almost together. Dina Merrill continued acting into her 80s, appearing in over 100 films and television productions across 6 decades. With her third husband, Ted Hartley, she acquired RKO Pictures and worked to revive its legacy. The daughter who had rejected her family name ultimately became the steward of its most visible inheritance. When the federal government declined to maintain Mar-a-Lago, Dina and her sisters sold the estate in 1985 to a real estate developer named Donald Trump for $7 million, a fraction of what it had cost to build. The performance and the inheritance had merged. Dina Merrill had built a life of her own, but she could never fully step outside the world her mother created. And with that, the story of Marjorie Merriweather Post, builder of empires, palaces, collections, and contradictions, stands complete.